withered dean. So the title is really an intriguing one, and when I saw the title, like Professor Echeverria, who's here today, I said, I'm not going to miss this one, because I actually think that land development is the topic area that we all know is really important, but we don't realize just the enormity of the impacts on land development that our whole planet is facing. So this should be intriguing, and there's going to be a little bit of a family story associated with this. So just a couple of quick facts about Blake. He has his JD from Duke, as well as his master's degree from the Nicholas School of the Environment. His BS is from the University of Montevallo, where he was recruited as a student athlete for basketball, and says he was one of a group of fading shorter point guards. He teaches at the University of Houston Law Center. Prior to that, he was at Stetson University, and prior to that at LSU. His research areas involve property, land use, and natural resources law and policy. And so in some ways, his background and engagement is wonderfully attuned to what we do here so well at Vermont Law School. And I believe his son, over in the corner, wave your hand, is here with us, and we're thrilled to have you in Vermont also. So, Mr. Hudson, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yep, I might, sir. Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I've been wanting to get up here for some time. It seems like every year that the colloquium comes around, I've had some event or life event come up, and so I'm thrilled to be up here finally. So my talk today is a bit provocative. It may sound hyperbolic at points, but that's by design. You know, so much of what I do is shaped by where I grew up and where I'm from. I'm from the South, and I'll talk about it a little bit here before long. I grew up in South Alabama on some timberland that had been in my family for generations. And, you know, as I drive around here, we flew into Portland, and we drove over to Halifax, where I presented at a conference there. We camped out in the Bay of Fundy. We've been driving around on our way back here. And, you know, I know there's land development here. I understand it. But I feel like it's a very different situation than what we're facing in the South, where we see lots of population migration coming to the South. We see a lot of economic growth in the South. And at the same time, as I'll talk about a little bit later, it's an area of the country where there's not a lot of love for regulation of any kind. And so it's kind of this bad mix, if you will. And so even if this is something when you drive around your home and you don't really see this the way I do, just understand that my comments are colored very much by what I see going on in a place that I love very much. So my goal with this project, nothing that I say here is going to be particularly new or novel, but my goal is to kind of throw out a provocative thought to kind of change the way we think about land development. I first want to convince people that while we consider many other environmental problems of more pressing concern, land development should be at or near the top of the list, because landed natural resources, from my perspective, are a proxy for so many of our other environmental concerns. And so I think about federal environmental law. So I wrote an article recently about, you know, there's a lot of calls from both the left and the right to reform federal environmental law. You know, you hear criticisms that it's too big and too unwieldy and the administrative state is growing. And you hear other criticisms saying it's not doing enough, it hasn't been updated to keep up with the times. And I wrote an article about if people really feel this way and state and local governments really want the federal government out of their lives, then do a better job with land use planning at the state and local level. And the idea is that, you know, a lot of the problems we see under the Clean Air Act are due to mobile sources, and those mobile sources are exacerbated by urban sprawl, right? Because we're not developing our land in a responsible way. So that's a proxy for air quality. Clean Water Act, you know, has done a great job with point sources. The number one menace to waterways now is non-point sources, right? So from urban runoff and agricultural fields, right, which have land use implications, and there are regulatory controls that can help with that and have long been available since the common law came to the states. But they've not been utilized effectively, right? So that's a proxy for water quality. Probably the most direct proxy is the Endangered Species Act. We need the Endangered Species Act, but I've started really throwing out there the idea that it's just it's treating the symptoms, but it's not treating the cause of the disease of biodiversity loss in the United States. It's keeping species on life support without attacking the habitat fragmentation that's leading to species being listed under the Endangered Species Act. You know, the very strong scientific correlation between habitat area, intact habitat area, and species diversity and species health. And so it's a proxy. So even our major federal environmental statutes, it all goes back to how we're using the land. And so I really want to change the way that we think about land development. Second, if possible, I hope we can develop ways to adjust stakeholder incentives to better protect natural resources through land use planning. So today I want to convince you that land development and associated planning are an extremely wicked problem, and I'm using wicked as a term of art, of course. We are in the Northeast. I hear my Boston friends use it quite often. And I'm going to articulate some of the drivers for this wickedness, and hopefully framing land development as a wicked problem will allow us to pursue solutions within the proper framework. So I'll be most interested in your thoughts about where to take this, what is admittedly a number of descriptive observations about what I view as the most significant environmental threat of our day, and provocatively I'm going to claim it's not climate change, okay? I'll get to that in a second. So last year I had an executive from Southwestern Energy as a guest speaker in my environmental law class. At the end of Q&A, I asked him, I said, if there were two environmental statutes at the federal level that you would most like to see amended, what would they be and why? I assumed that he would say the Clean Air Act or the Point Source Program under the Clean Water Act. I thought this would be his answer because while obviously crucial to controlling pollution, if you want to criticize those statutes, you might say that they are very invasive into day-to-day industrial operations. So they require costly technologies. They require constant monitoring and reporting obligations. Someone can just come on our property and inspect at a moment's notice, right? So I thought from a CEO's perspective, those would be the statutes that most concerned him. Overall, the compliance with these complex statutes requires a great deal of economic, human capital, and time resources on the part of companies like Southwestern. What was his answer? The Endangered Species Act and Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, which is the wetland fill program. At first, this completely surprised me, but as I've thought about it more and more, it makes a lot of sense. Businesses know that they can innovate to improve pollution controls. They know that they can build costs of technologies, monitoring, and overall regulatory compliance into projections of their future operations. At the end of the day, they know that they can continue to operate under the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act's Point Source Program, even if there are high costs associated with those regulatory regimes. But there's only so much land. Land, of all the resources, is a true zero-sum game. We can pollute some resources or cultivate others and still use or even rehabilitate those resources in the future. But land, combined with the natural ecosystems upon it, is a truly finite resource. You can either pave a wetland or an endangered species habitat, or you can leave it as is. And whereas a river or the air can become clean again, as we've seen in this country, a wetland or a habitat can never really be put back to its function, its full functionality once it's been paved, at least through human engineering. It would take a long time scales for that to occur. And we're starting to see some of that on the edges of Detroit, right? It's interesting, this dichotomy of the worse the economy does for a place, the better the environment does, as the environment's coming in to reclaim some of those lots. And so anyway, we're seeing some of that take place. But there really is no in-between. If you really want to see pushback from a regulated community, tell them they cannot put a facility on a piece of property that they own because there's an endangered whipping crane on it, right? And I get it. My family owns timberland in Alabama. This is a picture of it here. We've got these beautiful Adamasco lilies. We're only about 2 hours from the coast, but we're about 500 feet above sea level, so the ecology is very unique for the region. We have lots of endemic plants and animal species that aren't found anywhere else in the state. And I get it, right? So my family owns this timberland. My grandparents used it as a resource for sustenance. I grew up in South Alabama. It's a very conservative region of the country. my property class stays in stitches throughout the semester at all of my stories about my grandfather's self-help remedies regarding trespassers, which may or may not have involved firearms and other forms of weaponry. I'll let you guess about whether that is the case. And so I get it, right? I understand how private property rights, how people feel. But on this piece of property, we've come to understand the importance of protecting the environmental virtues of our property, and so we're shifting to more of a conservation management approach. I've been thinking about this seemingly simple concept for a few years, and I think it's time to reframe land use development as the most wicked of all environmental problems. Climate change has been described, obviously, as a wicked problem, which is a problem whose social complexity means that it has no determinable stopping point. Because of complex interdependencies, the efforts to solve one aspect of a wicked problem may reveal or create other problems. And there's no doubt climate change is a massively wicked problem because of the scale and the scope and the number of variables and vectors, okay? So this is not meant to say in any, or detract in any way from climate change being a wicked problem, but I at least want people to think about land development as being on par. But because with climate change, we're starting to see both market and governmental inertia towards addressing the problem. Far slower than what's needed, right? It's not enough. We need drastically more of it. But even in the most hyperbolic public discourse that we hear, the issue is framed as justice and humanity against evil oil and gas. But even energy companies are feeling the pressure of climate change's reality, and their stakeholders are becoming ever aware of the need to take action. And I know these are just a couple of anecdotes, but consider that all 5 of the major oil and gas companies who were recently sued in public nuisance, while denying liability under a nuisance theory, they at least recognized that through those court proceedings, rather quietly, it was not reported in the media widely, that accelerated climate change is caused by humans burning fossil fuels, therefore demonstrating a response to scientific and public pressures to at least acknowledge the problem. Investors have gotten in on the act. We saw Exxon's investors requiring Exxon to begin reporting climate-related risks to its businesses. And it makes sense in a way. These companies want to be around for a long time. These companies face a significant risk from ignoring sound scientific findings regarding climate change, at least long term. So at least with what we view as one of the most wicked environmental problems of our day, there at least seems to be a recognition of the problem, and we see attitudes shifting. Let's talk about how people feel about land development. Who likes land development? Everybody. Everybody loves land development. People want cheap housing, so we pave green fields as opposed to redeveloping brown fields. Developers want to squeeze as many houses onto as little space as possible to maximize profits. And they rarely build communities with significant integrated green space and habitat corridors like where I live in Kingwood, Texas. At least in the South. Again, understand my comments are colored by what's going on in the South. This was a community, ironically, developed by Exxon in the 1970s for its employees. This is where I live, right outside of Houston. And it's an amazing place. My son can attest to the bike trails. We've got 70 miles of bike trails. There's species corridors. And this is not a small patch of trees. This is probably 400 or 500 meters or feet of trees there. Behind our house, we've got about 100, 200 feet of a span of trees. During Hurricane Harvey, our house was spared largely because they preserved the Creekwood nature area, and it acts as a reservoir, right? You drive around Houston, you do not see any communities being developed like this anymore. It's all high density, high density, high density, right? And you don't see lots spread out quite like these anymore. And so, you don't see this as much anymore. So that's part of the development trend that's changed over the last few decades. And environmentalists agree, and I know this is another provocative point, but this is something I've really been kind of pushing back against even some of my colleagues about. We want dense development, hoping that it will curb sprawl, even though what really happens quite often, even in the most green places of all, like Portland, Oregon, is that development continues to sprawl outward, largely because of other intersecting policies that I'm going to talk about later. But now that development is far more dense and has far more less green space integrated into it. So maybe this isn't the case in Vermont or in New Hampshire in the Northeast, but in the South, what you get is, oh yeah, we're going to develop densely here, But instead of protecting densely elsewhere, they just put another dense development by that dense development, right? We're not integrating the ecosystem services into our neighborhoods and into where we live. And I see that as a problem. It has the support of local governments who hold the keys to land use planning most of the time, since states grant the authority to them, and they rarely coordinate local government activities, especially in the South. They want an increased tax base. They want economic revenues, new jobs to draw in new residents that then may result in the paving of even more green space. And consumers like it, right? Because we like to shop, we like to eat, we like to play laser tag at the new video game facility built on landfill right next to the banks of the San Jacinto River, which flooded during Hurricane Harvey, right? I mean, anybody could tell you that was going to flood. But it was built like a year ago. I'll show you an image of that here. So this is the San Jacinto River. If anybody's ever been on Google Time Lapse, it's a fascinating resource. You can go and it'll take you back to 1984 and show you land use change over time up to the present day. And it's actually quite disheartening. You know, if you zoom in on the Amazon and other places and you just see the green space being eaten away. This was in 1984, and this is actually what this space looked like in 2014 until they decided to put a Costco and a main event laser tag video game facility and other shopping right next to it on the banks of the San Jacinto. It opened up, and then 6 months later it flooded during Hurricane Harvey, which is not a super surprise, right? Okay, so and look, this does not always occur. There are citizens and locales, especially up in the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest, that do not feel this way. There are developers who go against the grain. There are local governments who make responsible decisions. But it nonetheless occurs with alarming frequency, and I view it as an epidemic, at least in the South. So what I'm trying to detail is what are the drivers in the far more numerous places where the stakeholders are not so conscious of the benefits of responsible land use planning, and specifically regarding new developments in green fields and open spaces. And let me just give you a couple of examples. So I'm glad to hear that, well, actually, let me just show you this image. So this is, again, part of my neighborhood. This area here, you can see this matches up. This is a FEMA map of the 100 and 500-year floodplains. So the 100-year floodplain is in blue. The 500-year floodplain is in green. 100-year floodplain obviously does not mean that it's only going to flood once every 100 years. It means you have a 1% chance of flooding in any given year, okay? So they knew that this area was in both the 500 and 100-year floodplains, and they put 270 homes, over the last 2 years, they put 270 homes in that area. The drainage pipes for this neighborhood run out into the San Jacinto, which I've been canoeing right there, and I can sit in my canoe and put my paddle and touch the bottom. Okay, very shallow, very shallow. There's been a lot of siltation from some sand mining and other companies upstream. Very shallow area there. So when it doesn't take much for that water to rise, to go backwards through the drainage pipes. During Hurricane Harvey, all 270 homes in that neighborhood flooded. And the same thing happened in this area, right? So this was a big buffer zone, a big green space that was converted into 1,000 homes, and it flooded. Everything in this square flooded, or this rectangle flooded during Hurricane Harvey. And again, I'm not saying don't develop, I'm not saying don't have a house here, but maybe we leave some buffer, right? Maybe we leave some green space there. So that's one example of kind of the mentality that we have regarding land development. And here you can see, this is, again, if you go to time lapse, you can just see from 1984 to 2016 the land use change, right? And as I'll talk about, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but as I'll talk about in a bit, so much of the problem with this is that we know with certainty that all the extra pavement and rooftops here increases flooding down here, over time, right? The problem is with every development that goes in through time, you can't attribute any extra flooding to any particular development, right? But we know that incrementally in the aggregate over a period of 30 years, that leads to worse disaster events like Hurricane Harvey, right? And so this gives you a good example of how much of the landscape, especially near our big urban areas like Houston, is being chewed up by development. Here's another one, right? So Houston recently the city council did, amazingly, by a vote of like 3-2, pass a regulation saying that they were going to require new development at 2 feet above the 500-year floodplain. Now notice, they didn't say you can't develop at certain densities in the 100-year floodplain. They said if you're going to develop in the 100-year floodplain, you've got to bring in enough dirt to go 2 feet above the 500-year level. Yes, that will chill some development because that's going to be really costly to do that. But if you want to bring in that much dirt, you can. And you're not going to flood, but that water is going to go somewhere else, right? This is a golf course. And listen to this carefully. After Hurricane Harvey, the Houston City Council voted to put 800 homes in this golf course. After Hurricane Harvey. Look where this golf course is. Again, 100-year floodplain, 500-year floodplain. There's damage that occurs to a golf course during a huge flood, not to discount that. For the most part, it acts like a big lake, and it's not as much damage as what occurs to homes, right? And so this is the mentality. Houston is a blue city, and yet they've chosen to put 800 homes in what would otherwise be an open space reservoir for flood waters, and that will increase flood risk downstream later on. So given this proclivity to continue developing green areas and knowing that stakeholders of all varieties in many ways blindly support this path dependency that defines how we develop land in the U.S., we need to better understand the drivers of this wicked problem. And this is not an exhaustive list. I'm just going to propose a few, and I've already gotten some feedback that I need to integrate into my talk about some other drivers. So one is obviously collective action, and that's not particularly novel or new, but people have diffused interest in environmental protection, while developers and local governments have concentrated interest in developing. Furthermore, though, I think one thing that complicates this is that people actually have countervailing interests to collectively act on environmental problems related to land development because we want affordable housing. That's a bipartisan issue. You want affordable housing. It's not like Democrats want expensive housing and Republicans want affordable housing. Everybody wants affordable housing. We want strong economies. We want jobs. We want goods and services. Also, I think one of the interesting aspects of this is that when we're talking about social pressure on stakeholders, who in here can name a developer? I mean, you may know some. There's a famous property case where the Del Webb, right, tries to develop that company. Del Webb develops that that feedlot. It's a nuisance case. But there are a gazillion developers. There are there are a number of oil and gas companies, but we have those 4 or 5 that we can target, right? We can put our collective pressure on to say you're the bad guy. Developers are hard to pin down that way. And I think also developers' business model is based on doing what? Taking the land, paving it, and then getting out of Dodge, right? So the whole corporate governance, the whole corporate model doesn't even work. Their shareholders, that's what their shareholders want them to do. Exxon shareholders don't necessarily want them to make sea levels rise at an accelerated rate. They want their energy resources, right? That's a different incentive on the part of shareholders, whereas developers, their whole business model is to do the thing that is causing the problem. And so I think that's a problem. Legal institutions is another driver of the wickedness of the problem. So we've got federalism. We've got 88,000 subnational governments or thereabout around the country. We've got a bit of a race to the bottom, which you hear about as far as even though the studies show that businesses don't necessarily make decisions based solely on environmental regulations being lax or not, politicians think that businesses do, and therefore they're likely to keep the regulations more lax for fear of pushing those jobs and those developments to other locations. Economics, housing costs. What do we know about urban growth boundaries in places like Portland? What does it do to housing costs inside the boundary? They go up, right? That's a huge problem, and I don't mean to sound like urban growth boundaries are the silver bullet, because there's been a widely documented discussions of how those types of density restrictions can have unintended economic consequences. I do think, and this is putting on my not really qualified economist hat, I do think that some of that's a supply and demand problem. I tell my students, who's been to Hilton Head, South Carolina? And they're like, oh yeah, and like, what do you notice about Hilton Head? Oh, it's nice. they don't have the big billboards, and they've got the green space built in, and they got low density. What else do you know about Hilton Head? Ah, it's expensive, right? The reason it's expensive is because it's like the only place in South Carolina like that, right? If we had more Hilton Heads, we had more land development, maybe those prices would go down because you'd smooth out the vacationers, you'd smooth out where people are living. So I think that there is a supply and demand chicken or the egg issue with that. But legal institutions, economics have these effects. Intersecting policies. So this is touchy, especially right now, but a lot of the urban sprawl reports that I've read are really focused on immigration. They're like, look, this isn't a political statement, but if we keep letting 1 million people into the country every year, Portland is going to continue to sprawl outward. Portland has sprawled outward 50 square miles between 2000 and 2010, even though it's got a growth boundary. It's paved that much more outside. And the sprawl reports I read said we need to at least cut that number in half to 500,000, right? But so immigration, and I'm not making a statement one way or another on that, but I do think that's an intersecting policy that is driving a lot of the land development that we see, is just having more people and more what you call population sprawl. The National Flood Insurance Program, is another one that when I lived in Baton Rouge, a third of the homes in Baton Rouge are in the 100-year floodplain. So you kind of have to have your flood insurance. But it's a huge market distortion, right? And again, I'm not so much talking about, people who built a home in 1970 before we had all the information about the flood zones and climate change and whatnot. I'm not saying we don't need a policy to help in those circumstances, but what really gets me riled up is the building new developments in the 100-year floodplain that then we're going to have these national flood insurance policies written for in green spaces. That's really what drives me nuts. But it's a huge market distortion, right? So I lived in Baton Rouge. Here's the Mississippi River, so pretend like you're looking kind of laterally. Here are the levees. Here's the river. Here's a levee. Here's my house right here, okay? This road that passes by my house was called Highland Road. Highland Road, right? Why was it called Highland Road? Because before we built the levees, when the Mississippi River would flood, it would come up to Highland. And so you were safe if you built on Highland Road. That's the free market. That's Mother Nature's free market telling you where to put a house, right? So if you like free markets, you should listen to Mother Nature. Well, what happened? We built the levees. We channeled the Mississippi River through one channel so that Louisiana is now sinking because it's not depositing the sediment around the area. And then now we have this. Just in the 5 years that I lived in Baton Rouge, almost this entire strip for about 6 miles along Highland Road went from being forest, which would have been jurisdictional wetlands under the Clean Water Act, but for the levee. But now because there's a levee, they don't need a permit to fill them in, even though during rain events it holds a lot of water. They built all these homes, and some of them flooded during the floods a couple years ago in Louisiana. So National Flood Insurance Program is another intersecting policy that impacts our land development. Politics and property rights. So in the South, you have very lax land use regulations. There's political resistance to regulatory controls, whether at the federal level or the state level. If you've read Colin Woodward's 11 Nations, where he divides the country up into 11 nations, kind of cultures and subregions, you see the Deep South and Appalachia, with this kind of resistance to federal or governmental oversight of any kind. And you do see that. 8 of the 10 most sprawling metro areas nationally are in southern states. Of the 221 metro areas analyzed in the recent Smart Growth Report, 38 of the 45 most sprawling regions in the United States are in the southern states. So, I have Jonathan Adler is a conservative environmental scholar at Case Western, and he has this book about let 50 flowers bloom and let states have more control over things so that they can be labs of experimentation. And when I read his book and gave him some commentary back on it, I was like, you don't have one example of good land use planning below the Mason-Dixon line. You guys are spending too much time in Yankeedom. You got to come down and see what the problems are and what's going on. And so that's another issue. Political economy. So the Louisiana, as I just mentioned, Louisiana coast has the highest rate of relative sea level rise in the world, because as sea levels are rising, the land is sinking. The Mississippi River used to flow, and it would bring sediment in, and then the sediment would get to a level to where it shifted the course of the river, and then it would dump more sediment in. It would build land over time. We've stopped that process with the levees, and so it's sinking at a rapid rate. So we have this Louisiana Coastal Master Plan. We're going to put $50 billion into projects, river diversions to bring in new sediment. We've got engineering projects for barrier island creation and the like, and we're going to put $50 billion into saving the Louisiana coast. They took a poll. Do you know what percentage of Louisiana supported spending $50 billion of somebody's money on saving the coast? 84%. I guarantee you 84% of Louisianans are not card-carrying members of the Sierra Club. But it's like the opposite of NIMBY. Not in my backyard. It's like in my backyard. Please save us. And so if I'm politician A and I come up and tell you, over the next 50 years, we're going to put $50 billion into projects to save your coast, I'm going to be dead for 30 of those years by the time the projects get completed. But we're going to do it. We're going to save your coasts through these projects. And I'm running against politician B, who says, you know what? There's a lot of scientific uncertainty about these projects. Sea level rise might actually, we put $50 billion in, sea level rise is going to outpace it anyway. It's going to render the projects useless. Also, sediment diversions sound great, but you can't just take an area that has been devoid of sediment building over time and just dump a bunch of sediment in it, because that's going to cause fisheries impacts. It's going to create eutrophication of the stream and have other adverse consequences. So what we would be better served, we get more bang for the buck to retreat, do some planned retreat to move out of these areas. Who's going to win that political race when 84% of Louisianans want their coast saved? Right? It's not a question. Politician B is going to lose that. So that's another complicating factor, and I promise I'm wrapping up here. Time and behavioral science. This is the one I can't quite wrap my mind around. It really is like the time travel paradox. Harms are diffused through both space and time. If anybody's read Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel or Collapse or other books, he talks about Easter Island. That baseline shift, that all that any one generation knew was that there were somewhat fewer resources, somewhat fewer trees, somewhat fewer forests, and they built their monuments to their grand society on Easter Island until they got to a place where they had burned through so many of their resources that they had to cut the trees down for food and fire and other things, and then they had no choice, and then all of a sudden the island is completely deforested, right? So the shifting baseline, it's hard to quantify this, but it's something that scares me the most is having students who look at Houston, here, and say, well, man, I grew up right here in this neighborhood, and we had all these forests behind our house. It was great, right? But 20 years before, if a kid grew up in Houston, it looked like this, right? And so those baselines shift. We don't have that memory through time, and that causes us to not realize, it literally is the frog in the boiling pot of water. And so that time is another aspect of this. And then the natural environment. So climate change is changing flood risk. We will have to retreat. Is it going to be planned? Moving infrastructure back from the coast over specific periods of time, while also building in buffer zones to protect the next coastline so that we don't just build a new hardened coastline that then is going to have to be moved again? Or will it be more unplanned and far more economically disruptive? And also the uncertainty of we're still learning about our natural environment. So the new information that we glean about the natural environment demonstrates the further wickedness of this problem. So there was a recent study, this was fascinating to me. A recent study found that 20 of the 30 megacities around the globe, so 2/3 of the megacities around the globe, depend upon 1/3 of their water supply from what are called precipitation sheds. So 1/3 of these 2/3 of the city's water supply comes from evapotranspiration that occurs in the green spaces and the ecosystem surrounding cities. So paving those spaces threatens water supply in these huge populated areas. Right? It's not unlike what you hear about Paraguay and Uruguay and so much of the farming there is propped up by the evapotranspiration that takes place off of the Amazon and brings those rain patterns around. And when you cut down trees, you literally change the weather when it comes to evapotranspiration. And so we're learning new things, and that uncertainty creates some more wickedness there. I've gotten other, there are other factors here. There's population, there's homeowners associations, right? There's private governance, right? There's other things that I've been told I should add into this wickedness. But my point here is to say that I don't think we are adequately considering just how much of an epidemic land development is. And I'm not one in my career. I've been very careful not to throw Molotov cocktails and try to be fair. But this is something. As I've over 10 years developed my research agenda, this is the thing I keep coming back to, is that we have to start sounding the alarm on what we're doing to the land, because it's hard to get that back. It's hard to put it back in its original state, and I don't think we know how important it was until it's gone. So thank you very much for taking the time. I appreciate it. You happy to take questions?
Yeah.
Comments?
Floor is open for questions, please.
Blake, I'm going to vouch for you in front of an audience that doesn't know you as well, because I've known you for 8 years. Oh, thank you. Mike, as a very, very tolerant and open person, I was a little surprised you had intersecting policies and you connected that up to immigration, because, I mean, all of the examples, which actually seem kind of representative of excessive land development in the floodplain. You pointed that, like on the banks of the San Jacinto River, that's not a guy picking lettuce for $7 an hour. So that's, I mean, to me, immigration seems like a drop in the bucket in terms of contributing to sprawl. What you do seem to be missing on that list is FEMA and state insurance programs to subsidize coastal development, since that seems like a very, yes, especially on the banks of the San Jacinto River, and I live in Florida, so you know how that goes.
Yes.
Right?
No, thank you very much. And let me speak to the immigration point real quick. Again, I picked up on that because of what I saw in these Sprawl reports, that this link between what these Sprawl, go look at the Smart Growth report, and there's another one, they're both cited in one of my recent papers, and both of them talk about immigration.
Is that from Mexico or Michigan?
Okay, so immigration, they're talking about people coming into the country, but also population shifts within the country. So migration and immigration. I should be more nuanced there with how I talk about that. I think that the problem is, like so much of this, with climate change, it's hard to know what regulatory tool will be effective. With land use development, we know what can be effective, right? We know that we can constitutionally, we can use the police power to put density restrictions, right? And under Lucas, you can't wipe out somebody's complete economic value, but like take that development that had 270 homes in it. You might tell people they could build, the person that owns that acreage, you could tell them you can build 4 cabins raised on stilts or something, right? And that's a little different situation than 270 homes with pavement, right? So we know the land use tools that are available. I think the immigration point is like, look, if we're going to keep letting this many people in, to the country and have what scholars, so there's per capita sprawl and there's population sprawl. Per capita sprawl is developing, for a long time, we were developing more per person the more people we got. So like if you go from 10 to 20 people, those 20 people got 1.5 acres per person, whereas the 10 people got 1 acre per person. That's called per capita sprawl. Population sprawl is due to shifts in immigration patterns and migration patterns. And the point is, if you're going to have those policies, if we're going to be letting people in, we've got to have a countervailing, more restrictions on land use to account for that. And so it's not that it is a drop in the bucket, right? Because you could imagine that we could let as many people in as we want if we had tight land use controls, and it wouldn't be a problem. We'd be building up instead of out or whatever, right? But I do think it is a factor that kind of complicates, I think, some of the issues with land development. I mean.
One thing I didn't hear you talk about was stormwater management regulatory scheme, and is there a possibility that construction stormwater management could help us engineer our way out of this with low impact development and green infrastructure?
All right. That's a great question. Can I pull up the, you mind if I pull up the maps here or the internet? So, see if this works. This might not work so well. But so here's the situation the problem that we find ourselves in with this idea that we can kind of construct our way. Obviously, there's a role for that, right? There's a role to be played there. But I have a very personal experience with this question because when we lived in Baton Rouge, you can see here. So our house in Baton Rouge was, let me see. Okay, so we lived right in this area over here, actually right over here. See this Dawson Creek here. So they took a plot of land that had been a forest right here. Okay, that was a forest. And they put a super dense development. I mean, you can see the parking garages in the center. And they put all these apartments around. They justified building that based on the fact that they put these detention pond structures underneath, right, so that the water would run off and they would not be adding any net flow to that Dawson Creek. And so under most rain circumstances, that's great. It runs under there, it fills up, it slowly percolates through the soil. But when you have a high pressure system that sits over Louisiana for a week, like we had 2 years ago, that might as well just be concrete, right? I mean, it flows and it goes in. It doesn't. My view is that these engineering solutions don't work during the extreme events as well, right? It's not an answer. So what ended up happening, I'm not saying it was because of this one, but the aggregate of these decisions along, our house had never flooded in Louisiana before, and our house flooded in Louisiana right there because of this Dawson Creek and all of the development that has popped up around Dawson Creek and is now flowing into it. So I mean, I think there are limits to, I think our structural engineering projects can help us to a certain extent during kind of normal weather patterns, but I think in extreme events, oftentimes they're not the solution. But that's just, I have a very personal feeling about that, so.
Yeah, so you mentioned my home city of Portland, Oregon a few times. I'm curious, right now there's a lot of people moving there, and Portland, they have a really unique urban growth boundary, but they're also toying with the idea of a residential infill project, which is really upsetting a lot of people that have lived there, obviously, that enjoy their green spaces, and now you're telling them, okay, well now you have to make room for all these other people. So I'm just curious if you could kind of talk about the tease, I guess, between trying to keep your urban growth boundary, but also the pressures of a residential infill project.
This is a great question, and I'm glad you asked because I can add a little nuance to my Portland point. I mean, land use in Portland is so much better than Houston, right? It's great. As far as leaving open space and leaving green space. I mean, Boulder, Colorado, places like that where you integrate that green space in. And there really is this trade-off between, do you draw a hard line and have your green space outside and try to be more dense inside the boundary, or do you kind of do as I suggested, and if you're going to have sprawl anyway, you build more green spaces into those areas. And I don't know what the right answer there is. I think unless you put a hard boundary and fully commit to those infill projects and commit to that through time, I think what you end up with is a really dense interior and then pavement going outside your boundary. If you're going to commit to the lower density, which then kind of exacerbates sprawl really, but you have more green space built into where you live, then maybe you need to commit to that. I mean, I don't know what the right answer is there, but I've thought a lot about that I don't think we're doing a lot. My point is, I don't think we're doing a lot of thinking about that trade-off, and I think those are the types of questions we need to be thinking about if we're going to better protect these areas. I have an article in the ABA, recent ABA issue called Curbing Dense Sprawl, where I try to talk about my neighborhood in Baton Rouge even. We had coyotes, we had foxes, we had birds, we had frogs. You know, we had all these species that were living in our neighborhood because it was a low density development. We had a 0.63 acre lot. I understand that environmentalists are like, those big lot sizes are part of the problem and part of the sprawl problem. I get that. But I know that we had a somewhat functional ecosystem where we lived. And I've started to kind of lean toward, I'd rather preserve some semi-functional ecosystems where we're living and just pave everything, continue losing these ecosystems where they are. And so I'm still working through that myself. Right. Right. I don't mean evil necessarily, but right. Exactly.
What would you advise the students in the audience about both courses and strategies to help them begin to solve some of these problems?
You know, I'm biased toward natural resources law, but I think a land use law class is one of the most important classes you can take to understand what tools local governments have available to them and how that process works. I know a lot of my law students tend to think about big firms and whatnot, and I know a lot of the local zoning boards can't just have a lawyer on retainer, right? I mean, because there are smaller municipalities and counties, and they don't have a big budget, and that's not where all the money's to be made as a lawyer. But I think by educating yourself on land use law, you can engage more effectively, if not through your practice, just as a citizen, right? And as someone who can kind of initiate these discussions with your local zoning board and so on. So I think land use law is a critical class to take to understand what those options are. And I would just say, you know, even if you are practicing antitrust law or some other area of law, I would say be engaged on the environmental front, because that's something that should matter to every lawyer, whether they're practicing it or not. And I think of all of it's hard to participate in the Clean Air Act. You know, you can make some comments through the Administrative Procedures Act online, the Federal Register. You can issue some comments, but the place where we have the most ability to change the world around us is our local land use, our local governments. And so I would just encourage you all to invest in that, whether professionally or just as a citizen.
Hi, so I'm from Northern California, and it's interesting hearing your perspective on this regarding flooding, where I'm from, we're mostly concerned about wildfires.
Right.
So with having open spaces, especially after the wildfires last year, a lot of the time now homeowners see it as a threat to their property instead of a beneficial thing, other than the hiking and the cycling and the enjoyment you can otherwise get from nature. There's this really large threat that homeowners see. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that a little bit.
You know, that's a good point, and this is somewhat off topic, but a big windstorm came through Houston the other day and blew my fence down. And so I decided I was going to build it back myself, and I'm a tree guy. I grew up with trees. My Twitter handle is Forest Law Prof, and as I was digging the holes in my heavily forested neighborhood for that fence, I was like, oh, I hate trees. I was like, so many dang roots, you know, so much work. No, but my point is I understand that, right? So you know, your perspectives change when you're put at risk, right? And so that's a tough question, and the wildfire question is one that there's a lot of corollaries to water law and flooding. You know, building in high-risk places. I do know that there are. I think the answer there is to look holistically at the suite of policies that affect the wildland-urban interface. And so, for example, we've got a lot of you know, forest policy laws that need to be adjusted to account for these buffer zones between the homes and the forest, right? So you have to take a look at your forest policy. You have to take a look at your zoning codes. You have to be more holistic in reviewing, and I don't think up to this point we've been as holistic as we need to do. Maybe in California, they're pretty holistic in California about those issues, but even there, as you're saying, some citizens are still concerned that now I've got this powder keg living, you know, next to me that could place my home at risk. And so, but I do think, especially in the southeast where you don't have any regulations on these issues, even though there's more people at the wildland forest urban interface in the south than any other part of the country, and wildfires are a huge risk in the south as well. You just don't see a lot of regulatory movement on that front. But I think a holistic view of assessing not just land use or forest policy in isolation, but looking at everything together and then informing citizens. I'll wrap up, but one of the colleagues I have out in Idaho said, look, we go and talk to people about how if you put your homes here, they may burn down, and they tell us to, you know, they get off their property kind of thing. And he said if we can go find a thought leader in the local community that's a trusted person, communicate with them and work with them and have them go take that message to the people, it makes all the difference in the world. So I think that's another communicative aspect that's very important. Thanks. Appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time.